picture this. We're sitting in a courtroom, right? And you're facing a criminal conviction for just a handful of posts you shared on social media.
Right. Just regular post.
Yeah, and the judge is staring down at you, demanding to know why you deliberately spread fake news to, destabilize society.
Terrifying scenario.
Completely. But instead of, I don't know, calling an alibi or pleading for mercy, you pull out Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem, the statistical physics of fluid dynamics, and complex network theory to mathematically prove that you are innocent.
Which is just, it entirely rewrites the parameters of a legal defense. You're no longer just arguing the specifics of the law. You're literally putting the fundamental physics of reality and the philosophical limits of human knowledge on the stand.
It is wild. So welcome to today's deep dive. If you're reading these sources with us, you'll know we have an incredibly unique stack of documents today.
Yeah, it's definitely not our usual material.
Definitely not. We are looking at a highly detailed analysis generated by an AI, specifically DeepSeek, of a very real documented legal case.
And it involves Dr. Chen Jingwan.
Right, a scientist who was convicted of picking quarrels and provoking trouble just for forwarding posts on Twitter.
And our sources here are fascinating. We've got the official legal indictments and judgments alongside Dr. Chen's own extraordinary defense, which culminated in a document famously titled The Blood Letter of Self-Defense and Accusation from Prison.
Just the title alone gives you chills.
It really does. And the sheer density of these texts is remarkable. Our mission today is to unpack this intense collision between a rigid criminal justice system and, well, rigorous scientific rationality.
We're going to explore exactly how a scientist used some of the most complex theories in human history to systematically dismantle a criminal charge. And, how a machine intelligence actually synthesized it all.
It's a lot to cover.
It is. But before we jump into the deep end, a very quick note to you listening. Because these sources touch on politically charged topics involving the Chinese judicial system, government policies, and party discipline, we want to be absolutely clear.
Right. Very important disclaimer here.
Exactly. We're not taking any political sides here, nor are we endorsing the viewpoints of the defendant or the state. Our goal is strictly to impartially report on the fascinating intellectual and scientific arguments contained in the original source material and basically just break down the AI's analysis of them.
Yeah, we're just looking at the mechanics of the argument. So to start, the baseline legal battlefield here centers around that specific charge, right? Picking quarrels and provoking trouble.
Which is such a broad phrase.
Oh, totally. But the core of the prosecution's argument was that Dr. Chen spread false information on a network, and that this specific action directly caused severe public disorder.
Okay, so that was the legal threshold the state had to cross.
Exactly. But when the AI analyzed the official court documents, it flagged this massive logical hole right at the foundation.
Yeah, the AI called it a category error. Right?
Yes. Basically, the court took 4 totally different categories of information and just jammed them into a single box labeled false information.
Which is crazy when you look at the breakdown.
Because according to the AI's analysis, Dr. Chen's posts actually contained artistic or symbolic expressions, like political cartoons,
right,
and subjective emotional venting, open academic debate, and then, sure, some actual factual claims.
But the problem with the court's approach there is that falsity is an objective metric, isn't it?
Right. Falsity implies a factual claim that can be definitively debunked.
Yeah.
You cannot logically or legally prove an emotion to be false.
No, of course not.
And you cannot prove a piece of abstract art or a cartoon to be fake news. So by lumping political cartoons and subjective academic viewpoints into the exact same bucket as verifiable facts, the legal documents just entirely bypass the need to actually prove that a specific event was fabricated.
That is just wild to me. Think about the implications of that for a second, That is like, it's like arresting a satirical cartoonist for drawing a politician with a giant head and then claiming the cartoonist is spreading false medical information about the size of the politician's skull.
This is a perfect way to look at it.
It completely misses the nature of the information itself. They just slapped the label rumor on his entire timeline and moved on.
And honestly, the logical leaps don't stop there. The AI points out an even more egregious flaw in how the court established criminal intent.
Oh, right. This part drove me crazy reading through the stack.
It's pretty frustrating.
Because the court's logic on his intent was essentially, well, Dr. Chen has a high level of education, therefore he should have known that the posts were false.
Yeah.
They literally equated his status as a scholar with automatic criminal intent. I mean, that's like saying a mechanic is guilty of buying a stolen car purely because they know how engines work.
Right.
It completely skips the requirement to produce actual evidence of what the person was thinking at the time.
That analogy perfectly highlights the absurdity of it. In formal logic, the AI identifies this as a classic begging the question fallacy.
Unpack that a bit.
So the court used conclusive qualitative language to basically skip the burden of proof. They essentially argued, because society deems this a rumor, and because you are a smart person, you knowingly spread a rumor.
Wow. So they used the conclusion they wanted to reach as the premise of their own argument.
Exactly. It's a circular trap. It attempts to substitute an objective, standard-like actual evidence of his state of mind with a subjective presumption based solely on his identity.
Okay, so Dr. Chen is standing in a courtroom facing this legal logic that is just circular and fundamentally broken.
Yeah, he's in a tough spot.
And he doesn't just stand up and say, you have your facts wrong. He goes after the very concept of knowing. Like, he attacks the philosophical foundation of how anyone can know that something is an absolute truth or an absolute falsehood.
And this is where we leave standard legal defense completely behind and enter the realm of epistemology. Dr. Chen actually utilized Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem to defend his state of mind.
Okay, I need us to pause here because Gödel's incompleteness theorem sounds incredibly intimidating. Like, how does a highly complex mathematical theorem apply to a guy retweeting something?
I know, it sounds like a stretch, but it is profound once you grasp it.
Right.
So back in the early 20th century, mathematicians really wanted to prove that math was a perfect, complete system where every true statement could be proven.
Right, that makes sense.
But Kurt Gödel came along and shattered that dream. He proved mathematically that any sufficiently complex logical system will inherently contain truths that simply cannot be proven within the rules of that system itself.
Oh.
Yeah, the system is always fundamentally incomplete.
So math cannot prove all of math. There will always be, like, blind spots in the system's ability to know itself.
Precisely. And Dr. Chen took this absolute mathematical law and applied it to human cognition and social information.
That's a huge leap.
It is. He argued for something he called cognitive humility and philosophical skepticism. He basically told the court that as a rigorous scientist, his baseline cognitive state is to doubt everything.
Including his own perceptions, right?
Yes. So the prosecution's claim that he knowingly spread fake news fundamentally misunderstands how a scientific mind works.
Because to him, a social media post isn't an absolute truth or an absolute lie. It's just a data point.
Exactly.
It's material that might be flawed, but is still worthy of research, collection, and debate. So he is essentially saying, if mathematics itself admits it cannot know everything with absolute certainty, how can I, a flawed human, look at a complex political post and knowingly declare it an absolute lie?
He is totally exposing the arrogance of the law here. He is using the most rigorous logic known to humanity to highlight how arbitrarily the judicial system decides what constitutes an absolute truth in a deeply complex, chaotic world.
Okay, I mean, this is a brilliant academic flex. I love the intellectual rigor here, but let me push back on this because we are talking about a real-world courtroom.
Fair point.
If I get pulled over for doing 90 in a school zone, I can't just tell the judge, Your Honor, speed is relative, human perception is flawed, and our understanding of physics is fundamentally incomplete.
No, you definitely can't.
The judge is going to laugh me into a jail cell. So can pure philosophical skepticism actually work as a legal defense?
The AI analysis highlights this exact limitation, and you are spot on. In practice, this defense struggles immensely.
Right, because courts need finality.
Exactly. The law does not operate on a philosopher's inner monologue or absolute cosmic truths. It operates on the standard of a reasonable person in society. The legal system demands a practical, functional standard of knowledge so society can actually operate, not a perfect, airtight, philosophical one.
So then why would Dr. Chen even bring Gödel into a courtroom? Like, if he knows it's not going to get him acquitted based on the reasonable person standard, what's the point?
The point was to dismantle the moral authority of the prosecution. Dr. Chen's goal seemed to transcend just winning the case.
Oh, I see.
Yet, even if the court rejects the philosophy, by introducing Gödel, he forces the court to implicitly admit that their definition of truth is not an absolute law of nature, but merely an arbitrary line drawn by the state.
Okay, but a judge isn't going to care about philosophical humility if there's a metaphorical riot in the streets. Philosophy alone couldn't save him.
No, it couldn't.
Did the prosecution actually prove his posts caused the severe public disorder they charged him with, or did they just assume that too?
Well, that leads directly to his pivot. Seeing that epistemology wasn't going to free him, Dr. Chen turned to his actual domain of expertise, hard science.
This is where it gets so good.
He used physics and network theory to prove that his actions physically and mathematically could not have caused severe public disorder.
The AI breaks down his argument into three distinct scientific frameworks, and this is where it gets incredibly concrete. Let's start with the first one, which is network topology.
Right, so in the structural context of a social network, Dr. Chen analyzed his own account and defined himself as an edge node.
Okay, an edge node.
In network science, you have hubs, massive accounts with millions of connections, and you have edge nodes, which sit on the very fringes of the network. Dr. Chen had fewer than 100 followers. His post received almost zero interaction, no likes, no comments.
So structurally, he is like a speck of dust on the outer rim of the network.
Yes. And according to the robustness theory of scale-free networks, which is exactly how social media platforms are built, removing or triggering edge nodes simply does not impact the macro structure of the network.
It just absorbs it.
Exactly. A system like Twitter is structurally immune to disruption from a node that small. It physically lacks the connectivity to shake the system.
But, the fear is always the butterfly effect, right?
Elevated.
Like, sure, he only has 100 followers, but what if one of those followers is a journalist and they retweet it, and then a celebrity sees it and retweets it, and suddenly 1 million people see it? That has to be the prosecution's underlying fear.
Which brings us to his second scientific defense, branching process dynamics. To address that butterfly effect fear, he used the Galton-Watson extinction theorem. This is a mathematical formula that calculates the mean offspring number of an event, which is denoted by the Greek letter lambda.
Okay, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. Is this similar to the R0 value we hear about in epidemiology?
Oh, that's an excellent comparison.
Like where if a virus has an R0 of 2, every sick person infects 2 other people and the virus explodes. But if the R0 is less than 1, the virus eventually hits a dead end and dies out naturally.
It operates on the exact same mathematical principles.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Chen basically calculated the transmission rate of his own posts. Because of his tiny follower count and historic lack of engagement, his specific lambda, his R0 for information, was deeply subcritical.
Wow.
It was far, far less than 1.
Meaning that for every post he made, it generated less than 1 subsequent share on average. It was mathematically guaranteed to hit a dead end almost immediately.
Exactly. Using the Galton-Watson theorem, he proved that the probability of his post causing a cascading avalanche of social disorder was greater than 99.9% impossible.
That is just a definitive number.
The mechanics of the network simply would not allow it.
And then he brought in the ultimate heavy hitter to finish the argument, the fluctuation dissipation theorem, or FDT,
Right.
which is a concept from statistical physics, usually applied to things like fluid dynamics or thermodynamics. It essentially proves that a system's response to a tiny external nudge is strictly limited by the system's own baseline background noise.
Now, how do we visualize that in a social context?
So the best way I can think of it is this. Dr. Chen is basically telling the court, my tweet is a single drop of water. You are accusing me of causing a massive tsunami. But the laws of physics state that a single drop can only cause a tsunami if the ocean is already in an incredibly unstable, highly critical state.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And if the ocean is already that unstable, the tsunami is the ocean's fault, not the drop of water.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanism of FDT. The theorem dictates that a stable system dissipates small fluctuations easily. If a small fluctuation doesn't dissipate, if it causes a system-wide crash, it means the structural integrity of the system was already compromised.
Which totally flips the timeline of cause and effect for the prosecution.
Completely.
Like, if a massive public disorder did occur, the state is basically accidentally admitting that their own society is inherently unstable.
Yes. Blaming an edge node for a systemic failure is scientifically absurd under the fluctuation dissipation theorem. You don't blame a single falling leaf for a suspension bridge collapsing. You blame the rusted cables and the compromised structural integrity of the bridge.
Right.
And crucially, the AI points out that the evidence suggests no public disorder ever actually occurred. Even after his release, his posts remained entirely ignored. The state essentially fabricated the tsunami to punish the drop of water.
Okay, so we have a defendant who presents a defense that is mathematically, physically, and logically airtight. He disproves the mechanism of the charge on every conceivable scientific
Well,
level.
he really did.
And yet, he is still convicted. His appeals are dismissed entirely without even being granted a hearing.
It's just ignored.
And this bureaucratic wall just drives him to the absolute brink.
Mm.
From his prison cell, stripped of all formal avenues of defense, he writes a 30,000-word document literally written in his own blood.
The blood letter. It is a harrowing, visceral artifact of this case. But what is striking about the AI's analysis is how it categorizes this text.
Yeah, tell me about that.
The AI doesn't just view it as an emotional plea. It analyzes it as a three-in-one text. It operates simultaneously as a rigorous legal defense, an academic thesis, and a political accusation against the very system holding him.
Okay, wait, let me stop you right there. I have to push back on this.
Sure.
This guy is locked in a prison cell. He is clearly desperate, and he is writing a 30,000-word manifesto using his own blood. That is an inherently extreme psychological cry for help. How can this AI, or how can anyone, really objectively treat a letter written in blood as a rigorous academic thesis? Doesn't the sheer horror of the medium kind of override the message here?
It's entirely understandable to react that way. It really is. But the AI analysis introduces a concept from political philosophy to explain this. It's called the exception state.
Okay, what does that mean?
An exception state occurs when the formal, established rules of a system completely shut down, when the court refuses to hear scientific evidence, when judges dismiss logical appeals without a hearing, the normal channels of communication are just dead.
Right.
In that state, the physical suffering of the citizen becomes the only undeniable evidence left.
Oh, wow. So he isn't abandoning rationality. He's just using his physical body as the ink because the court confiscated all his other tools.
Exactly. The medium is blood, but the argument remains razor sharp. He didn't just write a primal scream. He meticulously dissected the Chinese Communist Party's own stated policies to expose the systemic hypocrisy of his treatment.
Oh, right, like with the judge.
Yes. For example, during his trial, the judge allegedly lost his temper and screamed, "Shut up!" at Dr. Chen.
And Dr. Chen points out in the letter that this outburst directly violates the CCP's own internal mass discipline regulations, right? Which strictly forbid officials from acting violently, arrogantly, or dismissively towards citizens.
He weaponized their own bureaucratic rulebook against them. It's brilliant. He also targeted much broader national policies. He argued that criminalizing a citizen for sharing foreign academic viewpoints directly contradicts the state's highly publicized national policy of building a community of shared future for mankind.
Which is a framework that specifically encourages global cross-cultural exchange.
Exactly. He held up a mirror to the state, using their own foundational texts to argue that his conviction fundamentally undermines the rule of law they claim to champion.
It is the irresistible force of blind state power meeting the immovable object of rigorous, evidence-based reality.
And the tragic reality of human history is that, in the short term, the blind power usually wins the physical confrontation.
Right.
Dr. Chen went to prison. But the truth, backed by physics and logic, remains stubbornly recorded.
Which brings us to the end of this incredible journey. Let's just trace the path we walked. We started with a set of official legal documents heavily reliant on circular jargon and category errors.
Yep.
We watched a scientist try to inject the philosophical humility of Kurt Gödel into a rigid courtroom. We saw him map the thermodynamics of network cascades to mathematically prove he couldn't have caused a riot.
And finally, it all culminated in a desperate 30,000-word prison letter holding a massive bureaucratic system accountable to its own internal rulebook. The broader takeaway for anyone listening to this deep dive is incredibly practical, especially in our modern era. We live in an age of constant anxiety about digital misinformation and social media panics.
Absolutely.
Dr. Chen's scientific framework gives us the actual tools to cut through the noise. It teaches us to analyze exactly who has the structural power to cause informational cascades.
Right. If you've ever worried about getting canceled or blamed for a retweet that got zero engagement, this statistical defense is exactly what you need in your back pocket.
It really is.
We have to stop blaming the edge nodes, the everyday users with a handful of followers, and start looking at the hubs, the algorithmic multipliers, and the critical stability of the network itself.
It forces us to ask the right questions about how information actually flows, rather than relying on the panicked butterfly effect assumptions that courts and politicians often use.
And that leads me to a final thought I want to leave you with, something that builds on everything we just discussed. Consider the architecture of this entire deep dive.
Oh, this is the best part.
Every piece of source material we unpacked today was synthesized by an AI, a large language model, deeply analyzing a prisoner's complex scientific defense. Think about the profound irony of that for a second.
It is staggering when you really map it out. Human judges, possessing human empathy and human reason, either completely failed to comprehend the physics and philosophy of Dr. Chen's defense, or they willfully chose to ignore it to protect the bureaucracy.
But the AI didn't miss a beat. Because an LLM is trained on everything, it understands the legal canard, sure, but it also understands Gödel's incompleteness theorem, the Galton-Watson branching process, and political philosophy.
It could read across all those disciplines simultaneously.
Exactly. What does it mean for the future of justice when a machine intelligence is the only entity capable of fully understanding, archiving, and validating the interdisciplinary truths of a human being fighting for his freedom?
It suggests a fascinating future role for artificial intelligence. We often fear AI as an instrument of state surveillance or bureaucratic control. But this case proves it can also act as the ultimate, unbiased archivist of human intellectual resistance. Yeah, when the human systems of justice degraded into circular logic and brute force, it was a machine that objectively validated the math, the physics, and the philosophy of a man who refused to let his reality be rewritten by the state.
It's like the human diagnostic machine was presented with incredibly complex social X-ray and it just errored out. It printed a label that said rumor and shut down.
That's exactly what happened.
It took a machine intelligence to look at those muddy waters, see the intricate layers of epistemology and fluid dynamics, and finally read the math clearly. It's a haunting, yet oddly hopeful thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take care.